I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report.
The treatment of inflammatory bowel disease currently relies on immunosuppressive therapies that often lose effectiveness, carry infection risk, and drive high treatment cycling. Abivax is betting that fine-tuning rather than suppressing the immune system can reshape the treatment paradigm in IBD. Marc de Garidel, CEO of Abivax, discusses how a once-failed HIV candidate evolved into a late-stage oral IBD therapy that may deliver durable remission, how it acts upstream of key inflammatory pathways, and its potential in a crowded but still underserved IBD market. Marc, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
We're going to talk about inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD, Abivax, and its efforts to bring a novel approach to treating these autoimmune conditions. Let's start with IBD, which includes ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. How well understood is what's happening to the immune system that leads it to attack the bowel in these conditions?
Well, I think, as you indicated, IBD is composed by two main diseases. I think there are some differences between ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. Ulcerative colitis tend to be concentrated, in the colon. It's, the mucosa that gets attacked by the immune system. While Crohn is a bit more severe because it's more spread into the digestive system and it's intramural. So they belong still to the same class of inflammatory bowel disease, but they have their own characteristics.
And how do these conditions typically manifest themselves and progress?
So patients, let's start with ulcerative colitis. Patients who have ulcerative colitis tend to have early on symptomatic manifestations of the disease. Primarily, they have to go to the bathroom several times per day. So it's what is called stool counts in terms of measurements. But also, unfortunately for them, they also start to lose blood in the feces, and which can lead to anemia. So in general, for ulcerative colitis, the patient goes to the doctor with those symptoms, and then the doctor would prescribe an endoscopy to evaluate the state of inflammation in the colon through the endoscopy. And Crohn is a bit the same, even though Crohn is a bit more complicated because there is not necessarily a correlation between the same symptoms that I was just describing and the endoscopy.
These conditions are generally treated by seeking to quiet the immune system, either broadly with steroids or more selectively with biologics and JAK inhibitors. How affecting are existing therapies overall?
Yeah, so here again, you need to have a bit of a distinction between UC and Crohn. On the UC front, those patients, by the way, they are diagnosed on the average at the age of 35. So this is a really young patient population. For a while, for up to 7 years, they can be, they are in sort of moderate status. And then when they evolve to a bit more severity, again, the symptoms are becoming more acute. So in general, they are started with a 5-ASA plus corticosteroids. You can stay there again for a number of years. But it is recognized in ulcerative colitis by the medical community and the guidelines that they should be on advanced therapy. And the advanced therapy treatment historically have been based upon immunoblockers, very well known, like the anti-TNF, anti-IL-23, and drugs like Rinvoq, which is a JAK inhibitor, or more recently S1Ps like the CPT that was launched by Pfizer. But they tend to block the immune system, and as a result, they are very effective. For I would say at least 2 years. But then over time, this body, reacts to this immuno blockage and creates some resistance in some cases, a lack of efficacy, or the adverse events such as infection, opportunistic infections start to rise.
As Abivax thinks about the opportunities within IBD, what remains broken despite the wide range of available therapies?
Well, when you ask this question to physicians, we did pretty extensive market research in the US 2 years ago. And what they told us was they said we want 3 things. One is we want an oral treatment because most of the advanced therapy to date have been injectables or infusions. Number 2, they like the safety of a drug because, again, this is a young population and a working population, and they don't want, to be afflicted by serious adverse events, such as, having to go to the hospital for, pneumonia or things like this. And the third thing is indeed the efficacy level, even though, after basically, 8 to 12 weeks of treatment, the efficacy rise to about 40% of the patients, is still, not good enough for most of the physicians. So adding more efficacy would be obviously welcomed by the doctors community.
Your lead experimental therapy for IBD, ibafazimod, has an interesting history. It actually began life as a potential HIV drug. Can you walk through how you discovered its potential as an anti-inflammatory therapy rather than an antiviral?
Yeah, initially, the drug was discovered in France, in sort of the French NIH, and the intent was to develop a gene splicing agent who would be able to slow down and prevent the replication of the HIV virus. That's how obefazimod was sort of designed. After several years of experiments, including human trials, it turned out that the drug was not very efficacious for HIV. But on the positive side, the safety in this very immune depleted patient population was quite good. And it was really through a functional testing that obefazimod was found to boost the expression of a specific microRNA 124. In the literature, just to show the uniqueness of this experiment, there are about 1,000, at least 1,000 microRNAs that exist, and that modify, the messenger RNA and the translation of proteins. But what was unique with miR-124 is, found in human cells and is able to basically reduce the inflammation of dysregulated cells.
What convinced you that modulating microRNA 124 can serve as the foundation for a company strategy around chronic inflammation?
Because further work led to the downstream effect of miR-124, which essentially led to attacking essentially two pathways. One was the macrophage one, where IL-6, IL-23 is particularly present, but also the Th17 differentiation pathway. And those two are important elements of IBD disease.
Tell me about the decisions to shift from HIV to IBD. What was the internal and external discussions like, and did you have to reorient investors on building a plan for developing an IBD therapy?
Right. So it was back in 2015 when that occurred. I think it was helped by a leader, IBD specialist in Europe called Severin Vermeer, who thought that since microRNA 124 was going to reduce, the Th17 differentiation and also the expression of cytokines like IL-6 or IL-23, she thought it would be very good to test the compound in preclinical models. In colitis models. So that's what happened. The effect was, seen very rapidly in those colitis models, and led to starting straight into phase 2A program, since we had already a lot of safety from the HIV program.
Obefazimod is now in development for ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and potentially other inflammatory conditions. What is it, and how does it work?
So what we have done is after this positive phase 2A, we went into a phase 2B. We tested the three different doses of two different doses of administration, 25, 50 milligram, and 100 milligram was left because of some higher toxicity, and that led to ultimately a start of a phase 3 in ulcerative colitis, which started in late 2022. A very large trial, actually the second largest ever study done in UC with 1,275 patients, 36 countries, and with the uniqueness that in this study, we included the most severe population ever in any UC trial, including in particular 124 patients who were JAK-resistant patients. So we, embarked on a very large clinical program. And we got the results back in July last year with positive outcome.
Talk about this from a biological perspective. Why might targeting microRNA 124 might lead to a more durable effect than targeting, say, a cytokine?
Well, it's because it's upstream. So what we do is, microRNA has this unique ability to basically essentially return the body to the cells to homeostasis. So, for example, when we looked at biomarker data on microRNA 124 effect, the level of cytokine decrease is not 100%. So it's not again an immunoblocker; it's an immunosstabilizer. So what happens is you see reduction in 20% of for example, IL-23 or IL-6 or things like this. But it's a sort of dual effect of combining Th17 and macrophages reduction that leads to this very more tempered reduction of inflammation. Also, what was very interesting in the preclinical model, this is one actually I asked to do when I came to Abivax a few years ago. When you administer obefazimod to mice which are not, let's say, don't have any inflammation, actually nothing happens. So that's again the beauty of obefazimod. So if you are not inflamed, nothing happens. If you are inflamed, if tissue is inflamed, or you have a systemic inflammation, your inflammation is going to come down progressively, but not abruptly. And therefore, this is why we see a safety profile, at least to date, which is very encouraging.
You're exploring this as both a monotherapy and in potential combination with other therapies. What might make a good combination for this?
So maybe, let's step back. At least, doctors indeed would like to have in the long term, a bit like in cancer, uh, uh, to have an armamentarium of drugs that could be combined to strengthen the efficacy, especially upfront, during this induction period, because combating early inflammation is a good thing for patient, and it's a bit like in cancer. So you try to have complementary mode of action to hit hard, and then hopefully maintain immunotherapy for a longer period of time, so that patients are stay in remission. In our case, we are testing 4 different class of compounds, all orals. Those experiments are preclinical this year. The alpha 4 beta 7 is the first one. Lilly bought, I think a couple of years ago, a company called Morphic. Alpha 4 beta 7 are well known because it's Entyvio. Entyvio is a very large drug. It's an injectable drug. I think it sells nearly $6 billion in IBD, so it's a big drug. And its mechanism of action is very different from ours. So that's the first, I would say, priorities to test with this oral new class of alpha 4 beta 7. So second is also related to the excitement of a new a compound called ACO from J&J, which is an oral IL-23 peptide, where they've shown at least early data, phase 2 data, which is quite encouraging as well. So that would be priority number 2. Priority number 3 will be PDE4s. PDE4s have been used in other inflammatory conditions, not in IBD. And back in July of last year, they published, a Chinese company published some interesting phase 2 data as well in ulcerative colitis. And the 4th class are called AHR agonists, which is kind of a new mechanism that has been discovered, I think, more explicitly with potential benefits in IBD recently. And that could be also interesting. So by year end, we hope to have an array of results on those multiple combinations before we take them on into a human trial, at least for one compound.
One of the challenges with any therapy that's modulating the immune system is that you can run into safety issues. What have you learned about obefazimod's safety profile to date, particularly regarding its long-term use?
Yeah, I mean, the safety profile of obefazimod so far has been very reassuring. In our phase 2 study, phase 2B, and then in the first part kind of the phase 3, the induction that we published the result in July, we showed that in terms of adverse events, the only, I would say, manifestation of adverse events are headaches that tend to appear actually very quickly after administration, a day after administration. They last 2 or 3 days, and then they basically disappear. That's the number one adverse events that we see. And in the phase 3, again, in induction, what was very reassuring is that the discontinuation rate due to headaches was less than 1%. So if you take concomitant, let's say Tylenol, these are transient and they disappear. Otherwise, there's been nothing, no signal of significance that has been, I would say, important. We have seen a bit of lipase elevation in the induction study, but again, this has not translated into acute pancreatitis imbalance between the placebo 25 milligram and 50 milligram arm. we actually released 10 days ago at ECHO, which is the largest actually colitis Crohn's and colitis congress in the world. We published further safety data on that, and we showed that there was no really imbalance. So overall, the safety profile of Vizazimod so far seems to be very good. In early January, we also announced that our safety monitoring board met on December 18th of 2025. The maintenance data, which is again ongoing, this 44-week trial. And the safety monitoring board said, there is no new signal. Safety of the compound seems to continue. And again, this was for 80% of the patients who were included in a phase 3. So large data set of safety so far.
And as you think about the efficacy you've seen to date, which endpoints matter most as you review the data?
Well, I think we have again phase 3 has two stages, right? The induction and the maintenance. At induction, for clinical for the regulatory authorities, number one, the endpoint is what is called the clinical remission. Clinical remission was actually statistically significant for the 50 milligram. We had a 16-point difference, placebo-corrected, after 8 weeks. But I think, doctors would tend to look at two things beyond that. They would look at what is a clinical response. So in other words, it's not a complete remission, so it's an improvement of the status of patients, but it's not yet remission. And the second thing is the objective endpoint of endoscopic, remission or response. Because otherwise, the blood, the stool counts and the rectal bleeding are obviously a PRO measurement. So I think that's where, when we look at the data, but after 8 weeks, I think what struck everyone on the results was the fact that obefazimod seemed to have, in all line of patients, from again first line to second line to the most exposed, the most difficult patients, the JAK-resistant patients, seem to have a very consistent clinical response after 8 weeks. The endoscopic response also was very consistent. So, it was an 8-week trial. We'll know more, as we end the extra 44 weeks. But, well, indeed very encouraged by the fact that this drug may have, can be back to the original question, a profile which is pretty unique, or seems to be safe, and with an efficacy that is very, impressive.
The drug has a convenient administration. It's a once-a-day pill, but payers and clinicians often worry about adherence. How are you thinking about adherence, monitoring, and real-world use?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The question of oral treatment it's great for, especially for this young population. It's less obviously intrusive. It's easier to administer. But in practice, especially in other diseases, the risk is that they start dropping. They forget their treatment and so on. So what we have heard actually from physicians, we met with 18 of investigators in ECHO, so in Stockholm 10 days ago. What they like about our drug is they say that if a patient actually stop treatment, for a few days, the patient is going to start feeling, pretty bad quickly. So we believe that there will be a strong incentive from patients to stick to treatment, because if they don't take their drug, they're going to see their quality of life, go down. And they will feel much more miserable. So we believe the compliance will be more self-handled by the patients themselves because of the lack of efficacy if you stop treatment.
In IBD, it's common for therapies to lose effectiveness over time, leading to treatment cycling. How big a problem is that, and could obefazimod reduce or prevent this?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So actually, again, last year at ECHO, we published real-world data from the US, where the data showed that in the US, only 5% of patients are on the same drug 3 years after initiation. So there is a lot of dropouts in the space, and the dropout in the space could be linked to obviously different things. It could be linked to reimbursement issues, to co-payments. So there are things that are, I would say, may not be directly related to the drug. But what we know from current treatments, many of the immunoblockers do pose a problem of opportunistic infection, and we know that's a serious cause of discontinuation in current patients. So we believe that obefazimod, at least again so far from the data we've seen, may be more sticky for patients. The data we have, it's not a large pool, but it's about 100 patients who have been followed now. Well, actually, this year we'll have 5 and 7 year data, but last year we published 4 and 6 year data on the initial set of patients in phase 2A and phase 2B that we have followed in an open label extension study. And what was very reassuring is that basically their remission rate was about 90%. And the dropout was about half of what the other drugs we're seeing. Now it's obviously 100 patients, so one have to be a bit careful with this kind of thing. But our expectation is that this drug, if properly again administered every day, should lead to more positive outcome for patients and less discontinuation.
How broad a potential might this approach have in other autoimmune diseases, and how soon might you be exploring other indications beyond IBD?
Well, actually, till now, we did a phase 2A in rheumatoid arthritis several years ago. And in rheumatoid arthritis, the efficacy of the drug was a bit less compelling than certainly in IBD. In the fairly crowded rheumatoid arthritis space, company decided not to pursue further, but there was indeed efficacy seen in that setting. There was a bit also for rheumatoid arthritis, DDI issue with methotrexate, which was also probably an additional a bit safety challenge for the drug. But because of our life cycle, because it costs so much money to run these studies, company has really focused on getting short-term on ulcerative colitis, and now we are in phase 2B in Crohn's. So that's where we are headed. But it is true for a new generation product, miR-124 enhancer. We are indeed evaluating whether we could develop a new drug outside of IBD, like psoriasis or other inflammatory conditions. But we haven't reported any results. We are doing some work there.
Abivax completed an IPO in 2023 and followed with a roughly $750 million offering in 2025. What were the strategic goals behind those financings beyond extending runway?
Well, honestly, it was the survival of the company. The phase 3 program in ulcerative colitis is probably, when you add everything up, it cost nearly 300 million. So We in total, I think we have raised something like nearly 1.5 billion now. And just remind ourselves that developing drugs for chronic usage is a very, very resource-intensive undertaking. And also, in the field of innovation, we had to go to the US because the US investors are much more sophisticated, much more used to investing in innovation on the medical front. And it was the only place to really to garner so much money. So honestly, it was paramount for us to raise the appropriate level of money to carry on our mission to bring a novel drug to this patient. We need something different from what is out there right now.
You were able to raise large amounts of money in what's still considered a difficult financing environment. Why do you think you were successful, and what do you think sparked the imagination of investors?
Well, I think, again, several things. One, it's the unmet medical need. I mean, again, as we described, only 5% of patients in the US are still on the same drug that after 3 years of treatment. So it just shows that despite all the good things that the current drug allow, it's not enough. There is still a lot to do in this disease. So I think the unmet medical need is one. I think the fact that in the past there have been very large transactions in the space of I&I. You probably remember a few years ago, Prometheus, a phase 2 company, was bought by Merck for $10.6 billion. So there is for investor also a perception that if you have a good drug, if you invest relatively early, you can make great returns in the space. And I think the fact that also we had a novel mechanism of action, which could have been seen or was seen, maybe a couple of years ago as a handicap, is now seen as more an advantage because we are so different from the rest. And again, at ECHO, which again took place 10 days ago, I mean, the level of enthusiasm in the medical community about our results has been just tremendous. Again, this is very different from any of the other drugs. This is a true innovation. And the fact that also we released preliminary data that obefazimod may also have an anti-fibrotic effect, which could be particularly helpful in Crohn's patients, because 40% of Crohn's patients develop, what they call strictures, which basically, is an acceleration of collagen deposition in the gut, and results in basically a tightening of the colon and leads to, unfortunately, surgery. So I think these are the reasons why some investors wanted to invest in obefazimod and in a company.
Do you expect to commercialize obefazimod on your own, or are you looking for partners to do this?
Well, what we said is in the middle of this year, once we have the maintenance data, we will look for a partner outside of the US, because we don't intend to launch this drug, everywhere around the world. Even though the study we've done is again 36 countries, so we'll file, eventually in the EMA, Japan, China, and other countries. But for the US, we plan to continue to prepare the launch. We plan to file by again the end of 26, and we hope to launch in the US if obviously the FDA approves it in the third quarter of 27. So that's the current plan.
Marc de Garidel, CEO of Abivax. Marc, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.